Hey guys, Brian Castro from Better Chess Training, and in today's video, I'm going to discuss general opening principles for beginning players. And what we're going to do here is I'm actually going to play some moves from some popular openings and explain how and why these moves are made and how they conform to these general principles. So before I get into that, let me just talk about the three most common opening principles that are discussed, and then we're going to get right into the moves. So the first one is to try to control the center. Okay, and there's a few ways to do this. We're going to go over a few examples. The second principle that's often talked about, and I agree with, is to try to develop the pieces. And so these are the back row here, because these are the most powerful parts of the chess army. Okay, these pawns are very important, but when it comes to their mobility and their range, they are not as powerful as these pieces on the back line. And finally, the next principle is to get our king to safety, because checkmating the king is the object of the game. So I said that kind of quickly, but what we're going to do is go right into some moves here. Okay, we're going to start with white to move, of course, as we do in our games. And there's a lot of good first moves, and let me just show you a couple. E4, probably the most common. D4, probably the second most common. Actually, between E4 and D4, I think they're about even in terms of their popularity, and this makes sense. Let's go back to E4. E4 puts a piece in the center of the board, and because the pawns attack diagonally, it controls this square right here, the D5 square. Okay, and so one of the things I want to discuss here is that when we talk about controlling the center, if your opponent is also trying to control the center, it's actually very hard to control the whole center. I like the way Grandmaster Yasser Seirawan puts it. Basically says, own your fair share of the center, and the different strategies and tactics will revolve around using those squares. And I'm not sure if we'll get into too much of that today, but at least we can look at a couple openings and see how that could begin. Okay, so E4 is a very common move. Now, there's a lot of moves that black can play against this. The most direct would be E5, because it stops, it also claims some space in the center and is controlling now this D4 square. Okay, I guess before we talk about that, let's say if black were to just make a move like this, and what white would ideally like to do is put both pawns in the center, and then he would have a lot of control and a lot of space. And the reason you want to have space, the reason why you want to control the center, is that if you think of your pieces here, you can see that they're going to need to maneuver around these pawns or behind these pawns. So if you control the center, if you have a little space here, you see these bishops are now able to move. This queen is now able to move. Once you get this bishop and this knight out, you can castle, and the center becomes the pathway, or one of the pathways for your pieces to enter. So let's go back here. E4, E5. Now the idea here is that, so now this bishop and this queen can now develop, as well as this bishop and this queen. Now a very common move here is knight to F3. And the reason why is that this does develop a piece, and also it has a threat involved, which is attacking the E5 pawn here. Okay, and also because it's on the king's side, as we'll call it, after developing this bishop, the white can castle on the king side and get to safety. Just a quick discussion on that, and maybe I should wait until a little bit later, but the reason we want to castle fairly early in the game, and there are some openings where you don't castle, but the idea is if there's going to be a lot of action happening in this center, that it doesn't make sense for our king to be there. Eventually we want to put our rooks here to line up here, and a lot of piece fighting, fighting between the pawns and the pieces is going to happen in this area, and we kind of want to get our king out of the way. Okay, let's continue on. Couple ways to defend this pawn. Okay, we can use D6. This is called Philidor's Defense, and it has the benefit of allowing this light square bishop to develop. However, it does have the defect, but that now it blocks the dark square bishop. So the dark square bishop won't be able to have as much range, at least in the beginning of the game. So that is one way to do it. The more popular way is to play knight to c6. And what that does is, of course, it develops this knight and also defends this pawn. Now, white from here has a few different moves. He can continue with this pressure on the center with D4 right away. This is called the Scotch, and it is definitely a viable or a strong opening as well. There's also two other moves I want to discuss here today, and one would be bishop to c4, and this is the Italian game. And what this does is, of course, it develops this bishop, also allows our king to castle, and it allows us to, it also has maybe a long-term, or I would say an immediate threat that is somewhat easily defended, but of this pressure on f7, attacking the king here. And you can see if the knight were to go to g5, if it were safe to do so, which it isn't at the moment because of this queen, it can have two pieces attacking here. However, one thing I want to point out is that in the opening, I don't want you to worry too much about attacking, okay? Don't try to checkmate your opponent in the first 10 moves, because if your opponent's trying and is somewhat okay at chess, they're going to be able to avoid that. So really, in this first part of the game, you want to follow, you want to fight for the center or fight for a piece of that center. You want to get your pieces out so that they can attack in the next phase of the game, and then you want to get your king to safety. So let's continue on here and see how we can do this. Before I move on, just to mention one other move, white can play is bishop to b5, and again the immediate threat is to take this knight so that we can take this pawn. And again, there's a few ways. This is called the Ruy Lopez. It's named after a Spanish priest, I guess, that was one of the originators of this move. So as you start to learn chess, you're going to learn these different openings, and some of them have funny names, like animal names, like the orangutan and the dragon, mythical names. Some of them are named after places, like there's an opening called the Carlsbad formation, or the Scheveningen, which is a city. So don't worry about those right away, but just try to understand what the ideas behind what I'm talking about. But I am trying to tell you what they're called so that if you do want to look them up at some point as you get better, you can do so. Okay, so let's go for the next part. Let's go back to bishop to c4, because I think you're going to see that most often if you're a beginner in this type of opening. And there's a few things we can do here. Now, at this point, we've developed our two pieces. Black has developed one, and we have the pawns here that are symmetrical, meaning we're pretty much the same structure. So we're pretty even in the center. So black can do a couple things here because we don't have an immediate threat. Black can do a couple things. He can start to counterattack or just to continue this development. Okay, he can play knight to f6. This is called the two knights defense, and attacking this pawn right here, and that's a very good opening. Or he could play this bishop to c5, and both of these openings are fairly popular and very good moves. So either way, one is not necessarily better than the other. And as you get more involved with chess, they do lead to different types of positions. But again, I really want to just focus on this opening phase of the game and how to play some good moves. Let's just play a few more in this, and then I'll show you a different example. Okay, let's go with let's see here. Let's go back here, and we're going to go with knight to f6. And now, a few things I can do. We can actually go ahead and castle. And you might think, well, can't he just take this pawn now? And it is true, he can. However, white has a couple good moves here that he can play. And one would be something like d4. And if black were to play something like this, then we can play rook to e1. And now this knight can't move, and it has to be very careful. So even though black is ahead in force or material, because of the ability to develop another piece and attack this piece, this game is about even. So let's go back, and let's say white does something a little more direct in terms of defending this pawn. He can play d3, or he can play knight to c6. Okay, let's say he plays knight to c6. Well, here black actually has a little bit of a trick that I'm going to show you. Black can play knight takes e4. Now you might think to yourself, well, can't I just take this knight and then I will be ahead? Again, we have to remember the value of our pieces. The knight's worth more than the pawn. However, black has what we call a tactic here. Okay, he can play d5. And this is a fork, see, because here he's attacking both pieces, and since we can only move one piece at a time, white is going to lose one of these pieces. So typically in this type of game, white will play back here, black will take the knight, and then white can take back here. Now if we look at the amount of material, both sides still have 7 pawns and the same amount of pieces. So here this game is about even. So I wanted to show you what could happen there. Now that's maybe a little more advanced, but another way, let's go back here to d3. What black can do is develop this bishop, and then white can castle, and then black can castle. And here, we're going to stop right here. We have a nice little situation where both sides have several pieces developed, especially if white plays knight to c3 next, or plays his bishop out. But they've accomplished what they wanted to in the opening, which is to start to stake some claim in the center, controlling some different squares, and also getting their king to safety, as well as getting these pieces out. Because remember, I see a lot of beginners, they like to move a lot of pawns and they try to run over their opponent with their pawns, but really that's a long-term type of plan. There are some openings that do that type of thing, but for the most part you want to use your pieces in order to attack, because they have a farther range, and therefore they are more powerful. Okay, so that is the opening principles when you start with e4. Let's go ahead and look at just a different opening to give you another example. Okay, in the last example, I showed what happens when you play the king's pawn, or e4, to start. The other most popular move is d4. Okay, and again, there's a lot of different ways to meet this, but one of the best ways, or a very strong way, is to play d5, which stops this pawn in its tracks and also lays claim to the center. And what I'm going to show you here is a different way to look at this. So part of chess is trying to accomplish what you want to do, and part of chess is to try to prevent your opponent from doing something. So a popular opening here for white is this c4. Okay, and this is called the Queen's Gambit. And a gambit in general is when you sacrifice a piece to get something. Okay, and let me show you what happens here. Now, there's one way to play, which would be to take this pawn. And there's nothing, actually this is a fine opening as well. But what this does, so you may think, well, black has given up this pawn, or white has given up this pawn, but what white can do now is play e4 and control. You can see here now that he controls all of these squares in the center. Okay, of course, black will fight back, but that's one way to do it. The other way to do it is play e6, which protects this pawn so that it remains in the center. Now, if white were to play something like this, c takes d5, and black responds with e takes d5, you see here that black still has a pawn in the center. Okay? However, another way to do it is white can continue to develop his pieces, just like we talked about, our opening principles, while putting pressure. So you can see here, even though in the opening we're not trying to checkmate and trying to win the game right away, we are trying to put pressure on our opponent to make them, not make it too easy for them as well. But there's different ways to do that. So let's keep going. Knight to c3 is very common here. Of course, knight to f3 is also played. So again, there's a lot of different ways to open the game, and as long as you're following these principles and you're being careful to make sure you're not making an obvious mistake, you should be okay. And then as you get better, you can start to study the openings and the sequences more specifically so that you can learn more about chess. Okay, so let's go back here, knight to c3. Black often will defend here with knight to f6. Again, you can see here that there's the pressure and the fight over here is against d5, so that control of the center. But we're at the same time we're developing our pieces. Okay, very common move next is bishop to g5. So we can see here that if we move this knight, that this bishop can take the queen. Okay, this is called a pin, and it's not super dangerous because we can free ourselves from it. But the idea here is that white is developing this piece, and it's also doing something in terms of making it a little uncomfortable for black. Okay, so that's what he's doing. Now there's a few ways to handle this. Of course, black can go ahead and play bishop to e7. So now this knight can move because the bishops are, of course, are the same value about, and it'll be okay if they got traded. We're going to look at here is another move, knight b to d7. And what this does, of course, is it defends this knight here. Now, just to show you something, if black were to play something like d takes c4 here, then white can play e4, and now we have another threat, which is to play e5. So let's say black plays, this is not a good move, but if black plays something like a6, then white can play e5, and now we can't move this knight because it's being attacked, or because the queen would be attacked here. So that would be attacking the pinned piece. Okay, let's go back. So knight b to d7, protecting this knight. So if white were to take here, and again, this is not necessarily a good move, we can take back here with the knight and protect this pawn. Okay, but instead, let's say white plays e3, which is a common move in this position. Now the idea here is that we got this bishop out of the way, and if we remember from our last example how this bishop can get trapped in by its own pawns. So what white did was he moved his bishop out. So as you're playing in the beginning of your chess games, you want to make sure that a move you make, especially with the pawns, isn't going to block your pieces from being able to get out, because I see that a lot as well, and we want to be very careful about that. Okay, from here, black could play bishop to d7 to free this pin, and here white can go ahead and take. Let me show you something here. If white were to play something like bishop to d3, then black can take here on c4, and then after we would have to take back with the bishop. Now this is not horrible, but what it does is it loses time because we already moved the bishop once. Ideally, we don't want to have to move twice in a row because it would be better just to move it to the original spot if we had that choice. Or I guess what I'm saying is we wouldn't move it twice in a row on purpose necessarily. So that is why actually we take here first, so then we can move the bishop. Okay, most common would be to take back with the pawn, so that we have a pawn in the center here controlling this e4 square, for example. But it's not terrible to take back with the knight either. Okay, and now we can play knight to f3, and actually we could play bishop to d3 as well here. And you can see now this bishop is much more powerful on this square because it's see how many squares it's controlling as opposed to on its original square. But let's look at knight to f3. Both of these moves are fine to play. Black might play something like c6 to protect this pawn. Bishop to d3, now developing this bishop. And then black will castle, because again, we can see here now, they call this a half-open file because there's no black pawn. Okay, an open file would be if there's no pawns of either side on this file, but black castles and then white castles. And again, we have both sides have some of their pieces developed, and then they could move on to the next phase of the game, which is called the middle game. Okay, to finish up this video, I want to show you what happens when you are not careful and you're not getting your king to safety in the opening. This is a game between Potemkin and Alexander Alekhine, who was actually one of the world champions. And this game was from St. Petersburg, 1912. And in this position, Alekhine is black. And here he plays queen to a5 check, okay? And if white had another move, he'd probably want a castle, but in this case, he cannot. And because after this check, if black tries to block with the bishop, which would make sense, and then he can try to get away next move, then black would just take this piece here, and if we take the queen here with the bishop, then we take the queen here with the knight, and black would be ahead. For example, if black were to pull this bishop back, then we can take here, and then if we look at our board, we can see that black has 4 of the minor pieces and white only has 3. Okay, so black is ahead a piece here. So instead, also, just to show you, if he were to, after queen to a5 check, if white tries to block with the queen, then the same thing. We would take here with the knight, and after we take the queen here, then we just, actually before that, we could just go ahead and take this queen and we'd be winning, but we can go ahead and play this check here, and after the king moves, we take this queen right here, okay? Because we see this knight is protected by the bishop. Okay, so because of that, white has to move his king, so he can no longer castle, right? And after this, black is able to conduct an attack next. Knight b to d4, and he wants to put his knight here to check the king. Knight takes f5 to eliminate this bishop. Queen takes f5. g4, attacking the queen. And now here we have to see, this is the key here. Because white's king is out in the open and black has better development because his pieces are a little more active, he can attack the king directly and ignore this threat to the queen. Knight to d3 check. Of course, if the queen takes, we just take back with the queen and we're winning. King to g3. By the way, let's see what would happen if he tries to move his king here, for example. Then we could just get our queen to safety here and still protect this knight. Okay, so he went to g3, and knight takes d4. Okay, here again, ignoring this attack to the queen. Now, white took the queen, but unfortunately, knight takes f5 check. Okay, we can't go back here, and we can't go here, so we could only go here or here, and after this, we play h5 check. Okay, and we can't go here because of the knight, and this probably is not a good idea because of the bishop. So king to h3, and see if you can spot it. Knight to f2, checkmate. So I just wanted to show you that little game there by one of the early world champions, and it just shows you how important it is to follow these opening principles, especially when you are beginning the game, to control the center or try to at least control a piece of the center, try to develop those pieces, and of course get your king to safety, as we saw here what can happen when you don't do that. Hey guys, thanks for watching. I hope that you found this video helpful and I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please press the like button and check back often and consider subscribing. I'm going to be making more materials for beginning players and for younger players, as well as the content that I have for intermediate players as well. So check back soon, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos.